Hi everyone, welcome to the 8th episode of Barking from the Rooftops. My name is Jim Gillis. Today we have a very special episode. Joining us today as guest host is the amazing Gillian Bolland of Ethical Dog Training. Gillian is a dog trainer and behaviour consultant based in Glasgow, not far from me. We've known each other for several years and she's one of the most respected professionals out there. Gillian's methods focus on addressing the core motivations which drive behaviour, an ever-evolving practice which began 20 years ago when studying towards a behavioural psychology degree. So join me in welcoming Gillian to the podcast. Hey Gillian.
Hi Jim, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How's yourself?
Really great, nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
You're most welcome, and I've been really looking forward to today. So thank you for joining us.
Total pleasure.
Today's guest, Grisha Stewart, is an author, international speaker, and a dog trainer who specialises in dog reactivity. She runs Empowered Animals and the Grisha Stewart Online Dog School. She's an author of several books, including her well-known Behaviour Adjustment Training 2.0, New Practical Techniques for Fear, Frustration and Aggression. So join me in welcoming Grisha to the podcast.
Hello.
Hey Grisha.
Hi Jim. Thanks for having me on. Hi Jillian.
Oh, you're most welcome. You're most welcome. And so you two guys